Okay, so this evening's presentation it'll be by our very own Al Klase and some other fellow. It's rather secretive to the point where I really don't know what it's about. Okay, all I can say is it's very, very interesting and clandestine. So I am going to hand it all over to Al Klase and this other guy who comes in as 008. All right, so I want you all to sit back and enjoy and keep your mind open. Take it away, Al.
Al, you're muted.
Yeah, tonight we're going to talk about a spook phenomena called numbers stations. And I'll be ably assisted by Jim Doran, former U.S. State Department official. Now, so perhaps in the old days of shortwave listening, you might remember something like this.
39715.
And well, that's an example of a numbers station. And we kind of need to look at the whole subject of secret radio transmissions. And in most cases, all the way back, you do one-way transmissions, just broadcast the stuff. That way, your recipients maintain radio silence. You don't give the enemy a leg up on traffic analysis, even if they can't read the messages. If they know somebody answers, they know somebody's there. Originally, this was all in Morse code, starting with Spark and then moving to CW. Later, they moved to teletype, and now stuff like this is mostly digital. But there's another form of one-way secret radio, which is you read the numbers in voice via AM radio. And the CIA calls this a one-way voice link. And we'll leave Jim make some comments on that.
So we refer to what's more commonly known as the number station as Al suggests, as one-way voice link, or OWVL. And the continuous wave or the Morse transmissions are OWCW. So why would we resort to this? How come there's a need for and a resorting to this kind of technical approach? Well, first of all, intelligence is protected information. It's what we think of as secret, but one way or another, the people that own it, generally speaking, foreign governments, protect their secrets, military secrets, diplomatic secrets. And so you can't just walk up and ask somebody what it is, and you can't meet the people who provide it to you openly, because countries that have intelligence worth stealing generally have counterintelligence services, analogous to FBI here, or MI5 in the UK, or KGB Second Chief Directorate in the Soviet Union. They're looking for spies. They don't care that much about the foreign diplomat who's collecting this from them, or the foreign intelligence officer under diplomatic cover. They're looking for the domestic spies who are committing treason. So any natives, any members of those countries who have contact with foreigners are automatically under suspicion. And they're subject to surveillance or other means of control. So the foreigner, the foreign intelligence officer who wants to have that information, he risks bringing unwanted attention to his source. And those people are very few in number. Not everybody has secrets worth stealing. Even in a country that's essentially a closed door to us, there aren't that many people in North Korea or Iran or China that have actual secrets worth taking the kind of risk that's required to put an operations officer, an intelligence officer at risk, or to risk the source's life. So since foreigners are subject to surveillance, both technical and physical, you don't want to bring them into contact with the people who are providing them information, because avoiding that physical proximity denies the internal service a starting place to search for spies. Okay, so you've done that, you've figured that out, and say, well, how do we reach them then? If we can't meet them on the street, we can't invite them out to lunch, we can't, meet them in a hotel room. What do we do? Well, how about radio? How does radio work? Well, we could give them a secret radio that only they and we have. But if they get caught with that, well, secret radios look like spy gear because they are. If you give them a secret radio that we engineered with the highest degree of technology available to us, yeah, well, if you break it, you can't bring it to a repair shop. The nearest repair shop is probably 7,000 miles away, and almost certainly you can't fix it yourself. So if you've got that kind of spy gear, and Al's going to show you some that we actually, over the years, that has seen action in the field, it's got some downsides to it. It puts the agent at risk, and it's something that he can't fix if it breaks. On the other hand, many people around the globe, as you guys all know very well, listen to shortwave. In fact, I'd say percentage-wise, non-Americans do it a whole lot more than we do here in the US, because large parts of the world have relied on shortwave for their primary source of information for a very long time. And until 10 or 15 years ago, this was even more true. And of course, what I'm giving you is information that goes back some years. So the other advantage of shortwave radios is shortwave listening radios is that they're easy to find. They're not that expensive. They can be maintained by someone with minimal technical skills. And the most important thing from the point of view of the agent handler, in other words, me, I don't have to teach you how to do Morse code. And I'll show you, if you want to go through it, how hard it is to do what the number stations are doing. But believe me, it's a lot easier to do that than to teach Morse code. I don't know how long it took everybody here how to learn how to do it safely, securely, adeptly. But if you're teaching somebody to whom you have access for maybe an hour every year, and you're in his bathroom, sitting on the throne with the gear on your lap, it's really not easy to do.
Okay. I'm going to talk a little bit about cryptography. That is hidden writing. You obviously just can't broadcast your stuff in the clear. And this gets broken down into two areas, codes and ciphers. And the first one we'll take a look at is codes. And there's a couple of kinds of codes. In fact, in the early days of telegraph, you could just go out and buy a commercial code book in order to beat the rap on the, love is a 10th word in a telegram. This stuff was expensive. So you just send messages in numbers. Like, for instance, you could send 17033, any evening this week will do. And so you'd have messages made up of numbers to convey a message. Now, this was in the open. Anybody could go out and buy one of these books. But over here on the right, we have a chunk of the infamous Zimmerman telegram, which was an offer made during World War I, offer made by the Germans to the Mexicans, suggesting that maybe they should help beat us up, and we'd give them they'd get the southwestern states. So you can see there's numbers here for phrases, and there's a number for Mexico, and they get down here, they had to spell out Arizona because that wasn't in the code book. But that's an example of a code. Of course, the problem is the books get really thick and hard to distribute and things like that. The other way to hide your writing is what's called a cipher. And you need to learn to read, write, and cipher in grade school. And so what you're really doing is doing a mathematical operation on each letter, for instance, moving it 4 spaces over and using that value as the code. Examples of this: before the Captain Midnight secret decoder, back in 1936, there was a little Orphan Annie code disk that I guess you send in a box top or something and got that. But these are actually usable cipher equipment. Here's one from the U.S. Army in the late 1800s, and it goes way back before that. Of course, the security here isn't too good because there's only 26 possibilities, so you could sit down and just do it by brute force. But an improvement on that was the Wigner cipher. And what you do here is you change that key for each letter. So you have a key like the word lemon here, and for each letter you successively change the code. That makes it a whole lot harder to break. But of course, with a short key and modern computers, that'll collapse pretty quickly. But there's another version of the Wigner cipher, so-called Vernam cipher. And so, first of all, you use a truly random key. These are generally generated. You run an electronic clock, and you stop it every time a Geiger counter clicks. So you have truly random numbers. And you make your key as long as the message. And then you only use the key once. And even the high-end mathematical guys will tell you that this gives you a totally secure message. You're not going to break that with a computer. And so this is the technique that's generally used, the so-called one-time pad. You have a list of numbers, and when you're encoding, you add the number to your numbers, and then that becomes the coded thing. And on the other end, you need to subtract it. That gets a little messy because you're actually, you have 26 letters where there looks like there's 100 numbers. So it gets a little messy. In this case, the one-time pad is on this side, and this green thing here is a crib sheet to make it easier to encode and decode the message. Of course, like I mentioned, the problem of distributing the key is always tough. Here's a miniature book filled with one-time pads, and over here is a Russian stamp that had a one-time pad hidden on the back of it. So that's one of the techniques that's used, and that's what we believe is involved in the numbers station messages. There are some other historic examples of coded voice communications going back to World War II. The French division of the BBC, otherwise known as Radio Londres, which was run by the Free French and broadcast regularly back to Europe and France. And one of the things they had was a personal messages program. Before we begin, please listen to some personal messages. And then it would be things like, Jean has a long mustache. There's a fire at the insurance agency, et cetera, et cetera. And so there'd be people listening for these messages, and they'd have some specific some of them would have some specific meaning to the agents who were listening to this. Of course, if you're an agent, you maybe want to have a radio, if for nothing else, situational awareness. When Jim and I were discussing this, I said, hey, if those Japanese soldiers on Guam had a radio, maybe they wouldn't have waited until 1960 to surrender. But then beyond that, you had these embedded messages. To support this, the British built a bunch of different radios. One of them was a thing called the MRC-1, the so-called biscuit tin receiver. This would fit in a little cookie tin, and it was battery operated. And they made thousands of those and distributed them into the resistance organizations. Another radio that got used in the lead up to D-Day was a U.S. Navy set called the RBZ. These were originally designed for an outfit called the Marine Raiders, and there's a receiver and a battery box you carry on your chest. Headset goes under your helmet, and a clip goes on your helmet for the antenna. And the idea was that they could broadcast instructions to landing forces and things. But we took a bunch of those and modified them from the original 2.8 to 6 megahertz range to 15 to 13 that was better for picking up the long-range broadcasts, and dropped those into Europe. One other example, and this is a radio in my collection, maybe the coolest thing I have. This radio was designed by the Free Polish forces in the UK. Again, a separate radio and a battery box. It's 3 bands, and even has a BFO for receiving CW. All of these sets took advantage of the RCA miniature battery tubes, which were introduced just in time for World War II. So I went looking for the history of the real numbers stations, the numbers being read out aloud. And one of the most solid references I found was an article in Electronics Illustrated. Some of you may remember Tom Nitel did regular columns there, and he did this column called Real Spies, 007, a mere band switch's throw from 49 meters. And he talks about this subject in general, and he points out that he goes back to 1961, the lead up to the Bay of Pigs invasion. The CIA or somebody set up something called Radio Swan, broadcasting into Cuba. And they did the same thing with personal messages. Attention Stanislaus, the moon is red on 19 April. That's right in the middle of the invasion, that turns out. But he also says that many number stations appeared in that era, 1961, and shortly thereafter, doing 4, 5, and 6-figure groups in English, Spanish, German, and Czech. And so that's the most solid information I have. I couldn't find anybody that said, well, the first one we heard was, this and so. So this goes back into the Cold War era. Now I'll leave Jim talk a little bit about the Atención case.
Yeah, we've already talked a little bit about Cuba. Cuba is certainly one of the countries that was a prolific user of OWVL, and they had, a bunch of number stations. And there were also other countries broadcasting messages to people in Cuba. So there was, it was a two-way street. But one of the more memorable cases of these was a Cuba OWVL number station broadcasting from Cuba. And, you know, the thing about broadcasting these numbers is you can't really tell not only who the individual is that's receiving the message for whom it's intended, but it cuts a wide swath of what part of the world might be the recipient of it. One of the few exceptions, of course, is Cuba, which primarily views the U.S. as an existential threat, certainly did in the 1960s. And so anything that they broadcast, first of all, it's going to probably only propagate to the United States. And secondly, it's logical to conclude that they're communicating or attempting to communicate with someone in the US. Well, this one case resulted in an arrest and trial of the VESPA network, the WASP network of Cuban spies in 1998. They've recently, I think, all been released. I think they've all served their time and gone back. But the prosecutors, as part of their evidence, presented that the accused spies had been writing down number codes, like the five number groups that you saw on the one-time pad, and using commercial radios to then intercept them, type them into computers, and then decode them essentially with an online one-time pad. And the interesting part about this is it's the first time, as far as I know, that any government, not just the US government, has publicly acknowledged that number stations are in fact used for intelligence work. Everybody else, around the world denies any knowledge of them. The broadcasts are in languages frequently other than the language of the country we're talking about. So, stations in Cuba or in Russia or in the US might broadcast in German, or German is the most common, but in other languages. And so everybody's got plausible deniability at worst, but can claim complete ignorance at best. The only exception I'm aware of is when FBI testified in court that they had copied the decryption code and used it to decode the spy messages. So they've actually done this and acknowledged it.
Okay, well, now we'll take a look at some radios that were used for these purposes. And one of the early ones, Zenith Royal 1000, of course, this is the first solid state Zenith transoceanic, introduced about 1957. Now, the tube transoceanics weren't going to be real handy for use in Europe and other countries like that, because either you run them on batteries that are hard to get, or you're going to have trouble finding 110 volts to run them on. So you'd be looking at transformers and all that kind of stuff. So this was all pretty cumbersome until solid state radios came along. And then as time goes on, people like Grundig kick in with more sophisticated radios, some pretty nice ones. And none of these would arouse any suspicion. In most of these places, everybody had a radio, so you were just another owner of such. Now, radios like the 1000 are a little difficult to put on frequency. And that's why they would broadcast the musical interval signals before the actual numbers broadcast, like the British Lincolnshire poacher thing I played at the beginning. So you knew the broadcast was coming at 10 o'clock. At 5 minutes to 10, you'd start tuning around. You'd find the interval signal, and then you'd settle in on that frequency. The use of interval signals has kind of died out, because when you start getting the digital radios like the Sony 2010, they're synthesized. You just punch in the number and there you are. But small transistor portables were the way this was done. The other end of the circuit is, yeah, you could have somebody sit there and read the numbers, but pretty soon they got tired of that. And Jim, maybe you want to talk about this one.
Yeah. Well, let me take one step back for a second to your previous slide, Al, if you don't mind. The radios up on this screen. I've actually worked with sources who used 3 out of the 4. Everybody had a Zenith Royal 1000. When the Grundig Satellite came out, that was in some ways a real step up. But the quantum leap, as Al suggests, is once we had digital tuning with the Sonys and other digital receivers, it took a lot of the guesswork and a lot of the analog confusion, if I can put it that way, out of giving a schedule and a frequency. We didn't have to repeat ourselves 3 or 4 times because we could be pretty sure that if we did it twice, the agent would be able to pick them up on at least one of those 2. I had never worked with anything as sophisticated as the Texan, or as modern, but the other 3, yes. And go ahead, I'll move it again. But if you're talking about voice, sometimes voices can be hard to hear. Some of our sources are not the youngest people in there, so they may have a little bit of hearing loss. So there's an effort made to standardize the way the voices sound, so you get used to it. So this is an example of a machine that the East Germans produced for use by the German service as well as the Soviets and presumably other Eastern Europeans. That it was a voice synthesizer, essentially. You could synthesize voice or generate Morse by running a tape through it. And if you wanted to get even fancier, you could encrypt the tape beforehand, and then the message that came out the other end would be encoded twice or super enciphered. But the advantage here was if you were doing voice transmission, the voice would always be exactly the same from number to number to number. There'd be no variation. And you could choose your voice, of course, but almost inevitably it was a woman's voice for 2 reasons. One of them obvious, one of them maybe more sociological. The obvious one is that women's voices were easier to understand over the radio. The frequency at which a woman's voice normally is just easier to be understood. At the same time, the other aspect of it was that most of the agents were men, because in the 1960s through 1990s, almost everybody who had classified access, everybody who had the ability to get their hands on secrets in most of the world were men, and they preferred listening to women's voices. One other point before we move on from this, I find it very entertaining that the device was produced by the East German Scientific Research Center for Space Technology. The East Germany having notably never had a space program.
Yeah, that's worth a chuckle.
Yeah.
You sure about that last remark?
Yeah, here we'll play you the so-called German lady, 947, that 947. That's the ID of the station, and we'll kind of hear what this sounds like.
947, 947, 947, 947, 5, 3, 2.
And then that's your identification you're listening for. And the group count.
0, 6, 1, 3, 2. 0, 6, 1, 3, 2. 7, 5, 1, 4, 7.
And then she repeats each group twice. And at the end here, there's 4 zeros representing the end of the message. Now, Jim had a comment here about an emergency signal.
Yeah, actually, there's. I was reminded today that there's actually more than one. In some cases, as you see here, the person or the entity sending it identifies themselves with one ID, and they identify the recipient with another, and then this 20 here, in some cases, that will indicate that this is a live message. So now what those two numbers would be is something known only to the asset and the person who trained him. So, if he listens to 532 and then he hears 19, he can turn the radio off and go to bed. But if he hears the 20, that means he's got to copy these numbers. There's also a little, it's more complicated than it appears. On the one-time pad, on the key that the asset has with all of the numbers on it that he's going to false subtract from this one, there's a number that will match one of these 5-digit groups. That is actually the number where he's supposed to start. He may not necessarily start here. He might start here at the 94217 because that matches a number in his code book. And only he and the person who trained him will know what that number is. So even in the absolute worst case scenario that the Internal Security Service has either copied or stolen the one-time pad, they have no idea where the message starts. And believe me, if you ever try and decipher one of these things and realize that you screwed up on which number to start with, it can be very frustrating and very time-consuming. And even with a brute force attack, it's not going to help you. So these remain essentially unbreakable if all of the tradecraft is followed properly.
Okay, and Jim has a story for us.
So how do you get around this? If you're the counterintelligence service or a hostile service that wants to intercept this message, well, I just said the brute force attack isn't going to work, and you're not going to be able to divine who the asset is simply by the broadcast area or the schedule. Well, there's a couple things you could do. The Nazis used to go around different neighborhoods and turn off the power and see who still had electricity, because that meant they had batteries. And they would listen for a signal, and if they turned off the power and they still heard a signal, they knew it was somewhere in that square. That's one way to do it. The other ways are mostly non-technical. So what you have is a social attack. You find out what a person's pattern of activities are. Someone who has access to secrets that an enemy might want to steal, does he retreat to his attic every Tuesday evening? And the response to that is, well, you make sure that you never broadcast on the same schedule. So it's, Tuesday evenings in June, it's Thursday evenings in December, and it alternates, and it's on a schedule that even the source does not have. He's memorized it. He doesn't have the key. So even if they break into his apartment, they're not going to find that. So what are you left with? Well, we've been talking about this technology as it's used, what we would call station to agent. It's being broadcast from a central broadcast center that's controlled in a safe environment by the service running this agent, and it's being sent into a hostile or denied area. In other words, you're broadcasting from West Germany into the Soviet Union or Eastern Europe, and you're broadcasting to a single individual. That's normally how this works. But one-time pad can also be used for embassy to embassy communications. So some countries, before they had really sophisticated computer services, they would use the same one-time pad for their diplomatic traffic, which contained secrets. So I'm having to be very careful how I phrase this. There was a location where there was a source. There was a country in which an embassy was located that was of great interest to the US government. You know, that country was hostile, and this one embassy, in addition to getting all of the messages that were sent out from their headquarters to them, they were the recipient of all the worldwide messages. They got what we call circular messages, something that went to everybody. So they had, you know, communications that were of high interest. And I was dealing with a guy inside that embassy who was their number two. He was the second in command to the ambassador. And I had a meeting with him once where not much was going on. You know, we had a conversation. I checked on his welfare and whereabouts, made sure everything was okay with him, that he was still, you know, on our team, still doing what we asked him to do. And just to be thorough, I asked him, so, you know, I see in the paper your ambassador is having trouble with the host country here. And he said, oh yeah, it's terrible. They recalled him to the home capital. I said, oh, okay, so he's not here. And what happened to your friend, the code clerk, who fell and broke his leg? He said, oh, terrible story. It got infected. They thought he was going to lose the leg. They had to medevac him back home. And I said, so let me get this straight. You're charge d'affaires and acting code clerk. And he said, yeah. I said, get back in there and steal the code books. And he literally jumped up from the chair where he was sitting and he ran out of the room. And long story short, he came back with the code books. And everybody got very well out of that. Because, you know, we had taken the precaution long before of finding out what did the code books look like, how many numbers were there, how thick were they. You know, he had access to them periodically. What was the wrapper made out of, so we could open them up, photograph everything, wrap it back up, and send it back to him. And no one was the wiser, and we read all the mail for quite a while.
Okay, Jim. There was another story that ended this way.
Oh, I forgot. I told the wrong one first. Back up.
Okay.
So the less dramatic story, perhaps, but more entertaining one, and maybe a better note to finish on. We sent some poor schmuck out to the Horn of Africa, and you know, he was all by himself out there, and we gave him one-time pad and OWVL to communicate with us. And that meant that every night after he did his full day's work, he would have to come home, listen to a message, write down about 1,000 numbers, and then figure out what those numbers corresponded to in letters, figure out which of those letters made words, which of those words made sentences, and what did he need to do. If you've ever done this, you will quickly learn that you don't understand the message until you have the whole thing. You write down this random string of letters, and then you go back and you try and find the breaks between the words. So he spent hours laboring over this message he got late one night. And at about 2 o'clock in the morning, he was able to put it all together. And it turned out that it was a housing questionnaire. Somebody wanted to know, how much did it cost to rent an apartment where he was? What if it was 1 bedroom? What if it was 2 bedroom? You know, what about different neighborhoods? And he sent them back a very, very short, succinct answer. Me no time this crap. And so for many years, I used this as my answer to any stupid question from headquarters. Me no time this crap. All right, there you go.
That's a great story, Jim. If you get interested in number stations, they still exist. They're still on the air. And one of the primary resources is this Priom website, and you go there. It's got a UTC clock running at the top. It says the next station is on in 9 minutes, and they have this extensive schedule. And if it's a guy targeted for, somewhere where you are, sure enough, you can tune up and the station appears per the schedule. It's fairly mind-boggling. I did this with a CW station, set the receiver up, like 7 seconds before the hour, there was a long dash in Morse, and then went directly into Morse code. So you can still hear this stuff. You won't understand it, but it's out there. I've got a bunch of links to other number station resources. We'll get this distributed out to you. But it really, like the Coronet project, has recordings of some of this stuff, and there's another one that has the actual coded messages for forever and ever from certain stations. I don't know what that's supposed to do for you, but there's a lot of information out there, and this stuff is still going on. Some of it's run to Morse, and because think about it, you could decode Morse on your cell phone, let alone some little special purpose decoder. And there's some other digital forms coming on, but there are people that study this and keep track of it. Well, thank you for your attention. If you have specific questions, we'll see if we can do anything with them.